Murder.
Do not murder someone who's very violent.
Do not bear false witness against thy neighbor.
Are you a lawyer, Joe?
No, but I've worked with lawyers.
Okay, there you go. So, okay, that's pretty good. That's one of the least found. Someone put into the chat, don't covet. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. God damn it. Oh, whoops. Sorry.
Thou shalt have no other God before me.
Do not have any other God before me. Also, usually, not always so mentioned. It's obvious, but not there. Okay, what else? Sabbath. Good job. Right, it's coming up. It's almost Shabbos, 8:45.
You shall have no other gods.
No, Jerry mentioned that one already, but good.
Sorry.
I'm glad you're thinking. It's okay. Don't covet. It's in the chat there.
Do not commit adultery.
Don't what? Don't commit adultery, right? The jealous spouse always chimes in with that one. I'm just kidding. That's also, not everyone always thinks of that one. I think at this point.
No graven images.
So that's really, don't have any other gods before me. It's a commandment. It's very important, but it also highlights the idea that there are many commandments, many mitzvot that are not part of the 10 Commandments. For example, kosher isn't here. And that's a pretty big one. Love thy neighbor is not one of the 10 Commandments. I think you have all but 2. So you guys are passing, solid B, honor roll. Don't steal. Very good. Very good. I hope nobody's cheating. That's not one of the 10 Commandments, but still wouldn't be right. One more. It's actually very appropriate that it's not being mentioned.
Cross at the green, not in between.
That's one of those unwritten rules of life. All right. So I'm going to just put in one of our source sheets into the chat if those people who haven't found it yet. But last licks, people, last opportunity, anybody? So I just put in a link to the 10 Commandments, a listing of them, and you guys actually got all of them except the first. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Right? Someone mentioned before, no graven images. Well, what about God? What about belief in God? And so if we're going to talk about basic Judaism, we're going to start with the 10 Commandments. Not because they're the most important, but because the experience of the 10 Commandments and is what the 10 Commandments represent for God's relationship with humanity in general, and the Jews in particular, is really where we should get started. So you have on the list the 10 Commandments, is a little bit of an introduction, the idea that, the 10 Commandments, some rabbis consider these statements under which all of 613 commandments can be found. Also ties into the idea that not having graven images and the like is, part of don't have any other gods. So it has a lot of subheadings, and all of these commandments could have subheadings. Honor parents could also be honor elders, honor all those who deserve honor. But so the 10 Commandments are not really about specific, these are the most important mitzvot. In fact, they're called dibrot. Dibrot means statements. Another characteristic of these 10 statements is that they're generally divided classically in between 2 categories, between commandments between man and God, and commandments between humans and other humans. In Hebrew, the term is bein adam lamakom and bein adam lachavero. Between God and makom is a reference to God, and chavero is between a person and their fellow. So, I think that the 10 Commandments have are very well known, right? This is something that in the Judeo-Christian tradition is something that's very well known. It's something that in the realm of religion, the religious ideas, the 10 Commandments become seen as the essential component of religion. So that's with regards to the 10 Commandments. But what I want to do is dig a little bit more deeply into the first commandment, into the language of the first commandment, in an effort to unpack the 10 Commandment experience, what that represents for religion and how it really is an underpinning for this idea within Judaism, and to further explain what I said at the very beginning. It's about deed versus creed. Deed are actions, creed are beliefs, and we're going to see that that's very much at the foundation of Judaism. And I think one of the reasons why I am the Lord your God is not mentioned when I asked you for the 10 Commandments, that's the only one that was not mentioned, is because it's not a commandment. Right? I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt is not a commandment. It's a statement. It's presenting something. And if we look at that one sentence, right, you see it there, number one in the Hebrew and in the English. I am the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. We can find 4 important principles that can set us off on our exploration of the fundamentals of Judaism. The first is in the very first couple of words in the Hebrew, Anochi Hashem. I am the Lord. In effect, this is God's debut to humanity. When we think about the religion, we think about how significant the 10 Commandments are to all people of faith. It's because this is where God spoke to human beings. This is the idea that God said, "I'm here." It's it's like the season premiere of Saturday Night Live. Not really. Saturday Night Live is not as good as the 10 Commandments. God's much better. Saturday Night Live might seem funnier, although with everything going on these last 7 months, God certainly seems to have a sense of humor. But the idea of I am God, that's a pretty big statement. And that's something that hadn't happened on a wide scale ever before. We know that and we're starting to read the stories of the Torah, of the Bible. We're encountering Adam and Eve and Noah, and we're going to encounter Abraham in this week's Torah portion and next week in particular. So God has a relationship with human beings, but this is mass scale. This is, broadband, 5G. Everyone knows about it. I am God. And that's something very significant for human beings to process, that there's a divine higher power. So that's point number one. Point number two is in the very next word, Elokecha, which in Hebrew, which translates into English as your God. I am God, your God. The fact that this is not when God introduced debut to humanity, it wasn't only about God being a supreme being. That's true, but there's meant to be an element of a personal God. We have a relationship with God. Human beings and God can connect. And this is something that is, blows the mind. How can an infinite being have any connection with finite humans? How can an infinite being have anything to do with, those who are limited? These are, very difficult questions. It's almost ridiculous to think about the supreme being having an interest in me or you or anybody else. This has been something very difficult within Jewish philosophy. There are those Jewish philosophers who have a hard time with the idea that God has an interest in individual human beings. Can God care about what I do? Why should it matter? But from the very beginning, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm God, your God. God has a relationship with that which God created. The next expression is Asher Hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I brought you from the land of Egypt. And here, the commandment or the utterance or the statement is, in effect, the way that God presents how that relationship with God is meant to be found, right? It's one thing to say there's a God, a supreme being. It's another thing to say that God has a relationship with creation. But how do you bridge that? How do you make sense of the fact that there's a relationship between God and creation? And so here we see that when God made the debut in front of humanity, what did God say to the Jewish people? I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. Number of commentators, notably Rabbi Judah Halevi, 11th century Spanish philosopher and poet, asked the question, if this is God's big debut, God could have said something else. God could have been more impressive. God could have said, I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth. That's a bigger deal. That's relevant to every single person. That's not just about the Israelites who had been freed from Egypt. It's almost like if you have a situation where you have a Harvard-trained specialist in, neurosurgery, and on the doctor's wall in his office, it has his high school diploma from Cheyenne, Wyoming. He went to Cheyenne High. right? That's not what you would normally expect the doctor to be posting in his office. What would you expect the doctor to post in the office? The awards, the Harvard degree, things which are much more impressive. So, why would that doctor post that high school degree from Cheyenne, Wyoming? The likelihood is because it means something to that individual. And when we're talking about here, when God says, "I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt," this was something very personal, because who is standing around Sinai? The Jewish nation, who 7 weeks earlier had been slaves in Egypt. They are the ones who can appreciate God and the relationship with God, because they had experienced God in a very personal way through the plagues and through the Exodus and through the splitting of the Red Sea. The idea that we're meant to experience God in a very personal way. Some people, it's in a sunset. Some people, it's when bad things happen. Less likely, it's sometimes when good things happen. Part of Judaism is to wake up in the morning and thank God, Modeh Ani. So the idea of, "I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt," is making mention of the fact that when we look to try and understand what it means for God to have a relationship with creation, we're supposed to find our own personal path. The Jewish nation was able to find that path for themselves because they had experienced God's salvation, God's redemption in Egypt. And when we talk about God, we're supposed to try and find a similar way of connecting to God. And last but not least, the fourth expression, the fourth concept that emerges from this statement is Mibes Avadim, from the house of bondage. What can we possibly learn? We know that it's God took the Jewish nation from Egypt. What does it say that also from the house of bondage? What's significant about mentioning that God took the Israelites from the house of bondage? And so for here, if what we've been saying until now is to help us understand how individuals, human beings, can have a relationship and should seek their relationship, their own unique individual relationship with God. If we would stop there, that sounds pretty spiritual. It may also sound in many ways loosey-goosey, right? I'm okay, I love God. God creates ice cream. I love ice cream. I love God. I feel spiritual. I love God. I'm angry at God. It's okay. I'll come back to God in a couple of years. It's really very, very subjective. And there's a certain subjectivity that's essential. But Mibeit Avadim, from the house of bondage, Eved is a slave. The Jewish nation's experience had been slaves to a master, a taskmaster, the Pharaoh. Now that God has redeemed the Jewish nation and now is giving them a divine revelation of a relationship, God is introducing that the relationship between God and the Jewish nation is also one of master and commander, and the Jewish nation now has a new master. The Jewish people could have remained slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. God exists. God has a relationship with creation. That relationship is very much governed subjectively by how we experience God. But never forget that for Torah and for Judaism, Mibeit Avadim, God has replaced Pharaoh as our master and commander. God is in charge. There's an element of commandedness and obligation that's part of the relationship with God. It's not all loosey-goosey. And here we see the two components of deed and creed. Creed, religious experience, faith. I am the Lord your God, who you find through your own personal experience, like for the Jewish nation, the Exodus, like for each of us, however we want to experience God. Creed. At the same time, Mibeit Avadim, we are obligated, we are commanded. There are things that we have to do, even if we don't want to, because God says we have to. And that's the idea of the deed. When it comes to our relationship with God, we are balancing the creed and the deed, or in another way of describing it, the religious experience on the one hand and religious obligation on the other. And having all of these ideas within the introduction of God to humanity, with the beginning of the covenant that's being established between God and the Jewish people, is that all of these are coming together as one, as a reminder as to the relationship that we have with God, being predicated on both of these things. And there's a second source sheet that I linked to that has a couple of comments. You notice it mentions the 10 Commandments, and then, of course, the two words deed and creed. The idea that we have a religious experience and we have a religious obligation. In Judaism, the two are intricately combined together. And with that as an introduction, and that we're not going to go into each of the 10 commandments now. We're going to cover Shabbat next week. But what the flow of the continuation of the 10 commandments is that God has introduced himself to humanity and set a covenant with the Jewish nation. And we have a personal relationship that we're supposed to seek out. And it's going to be modified and guided through the commandments that God has for the Jewish nation. Those commandments will involve rituals that have really express our relationship with God. Sabbath, don't take God's name in vain, don't have false gods, and also it manifests itself in a lot of rules and regulations concerning society, how we relate to other people, honoring our parents, not to bear false witness, etc. That's part of the 10 statements introduction, and then the rest of the Torah fills in the gaps in the other 613 commandments. So that is the role of the 10 commandments underlying as an introduction to the fundamentals within Judaism. That first commandment tees up the role of our relationship with God, one of religious experience and religious obligation. And then we'll move into just a little bit more about what it means to believe in God and how that plays out as a foundation of Judaism. But if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand, unmute, or put them into the chat. We will, if there are no questions, we'll move on to, we'll just talk about God a little bit. But I just want, any questions? All right, so let's unpack this a little bit. And the way this course has been designed is to cover 5 subjects: God, prayer, Shabbat, Jewish ritual, and sexuality. It's based on a course developed by NJOP, National Jewish Outreach Program, Rabbi Ephraim Buchwald, a leader in education and engagement in Jewish outreach. And we're going to see that these are really, we're going to extend from one to the other or climb a ladder. And of course, we leave sexuality for the last to make sure everyone shows up at the end. Spoiler alert, it's not that, exciting. But it is going to, there is a reason why it's the last step on this 5 subject ladder. So when we talk about God, and we referenced this a little bit before, 4th one was Jewish observance in general, system of Jewish ritual. God, prayer, Shabbat, the larger system of Jewish ritual, and sexuality, or we can call it relationships. So when we talk about the commandment to believe in God, as was mentioned in passing, it's not clear there is a commandment to believe in God, because how can you command belief? And if you look in the Jewish commentators and scholars, from Talmudic times and into the medieval era, when a lot of these discussions had, there's a section on Jewish literacy later in this course, but, we have the Bible, we have the Torah, the written Torah, we have the oral tradition, we have those traditions that were then written down and put into what's called the Talmud. You may have heard words Mishnah and Gemara. Those are all part of the Talmudic literature. And this is taking us till around the year 500. Then you have post 500, the development of Jewish law and Jewish philosophy very actively from around the year 500 till around the year 1200. From 1200 to 1600, you have a further evolution and expansion and more talk about Jewish philosophy and Jewish mysticism. 1600s and on, obviously you're studying all the material, then the law codes develop as a main source of Jewish practice. But so, there was a lot of talk about what does it mean to believe in God? And you had those who felt that belief in God is not a commandment. How can it be a commandment? I can't tell you what to believe. If I love the way something tastes, I can't command you to say this tastes good. There's a certain subjectivity. Matters of the heart are very difficult. It's like, when the genie gives you 3 wishes, you can't, one of the wishes can't be to have someone love you, right? I don't see Aladdin, right? It doesn't work that way. I can't command someone to love. There's certain matters of the heart and the mind which are beyond being compelled. So there are those who feel it's not a mitzvah. And there are others who feel that mitzvah is not just about obligatory acts. It's a state of mind. It's a connection. In fact, the word mitzvah from the Hebrew word tzivah means commandment. It's obligation. Some people translate it as good deed. It's much more than a good deed. It's an obligation. but it also serves in the Hebrew language to connote a connection. There's a connection between God and humanity. And so in that respect, belief in God is essential. It's definitely a mitzvah. It represents the way that human beings connect to God. So it makes a lot of sense for belief to be a mitzvah. However you want to look at it, belief is, but whether it's a one of 613 or not, it's essential. There's no Judaism without God. Now, how proactively individuals have to focus on God may depend on the individual. It's very often a matter of perspective. If you look at the story in the section on God, a king in Africa was out hunting. His companion and gun bearer was a person whose attitude towards life is, "It couldn't be better. This is for the good." The gun bearer erred in loading the king's rifle, causing a misfire which blew off the king's thumb. When the gun bearer exclaimed, "This is for the good," the king replied, "No, it's not," and had the gun bearer put in jail. Close to a year later, the king was once again hunting. This time he was captured by cannibals. They were ready to prepare the king for dinner. When they noticed the missing thumb, being superstitious, the cannibals would not eat someone who was less than whole, so they let the king go. Immediately, the king went to the jail to free his gunner. "You were right. This was for the good. I was so terribly sorry that I sent you to jail." "No," replied the gun bearer. "Being in jail was also for the good." "What do you mean? Look how you suffered," said the king. "Yes," replied the gun bearer, "but if I wasn't in jail, I would have been with you. And with all of the thumbs, he would have been eaten." So again, there's a certain mentality, but it highlights that there is a certain condition for faith and belief, and sometimes it will depend on how we think about it, and sometimes we don't think about it. So, for example, I would imagine that many people here have an alarm clock. Why is there an alarm clock? You have an alarm clock to wake up in the morning. You curse it, but you have it anyway. Why do you set the alarm to wake up in the morning? You have places to go, or even if you have places to go, you usually have a schedule that you have to keep. Fine. But how do you know you're going to wake up in the morning? Like literally, how do you know that after closing your eyes and going to sleep that you will actually awake the next morning? Now, you don't, but how many people here really agonize about that before going to sleep? We generally don't. We set the alarm clock. We expect this is what's going to happen. But really, we are taking a giant leap of faith that things will happen. Why do we take that leap of faith? Because hopefully we're in fairly good health and we have woken up for mornings before, and we don't expect anything necessarily to change. We are aware and sometimes hear about situations that do shake that certainty. But this certainty we have that we wake up is very much also a matter of faith. And there's a recognition of if we stop to think about it, we take a lot of things on faith that if we would analyze more deeply could scare the living daylights out of us. And there's often times that when our faith is shaken, and it was also referenced earlier before, when bad things happen, people are always like, "Oh, where was God?" Right? Why do bad things happen to good people? How come no one says, "Oh, why did I win the lottery? God, why me?" Right? It doesn't happen that way. And sometimes the very fact that we wonder, where is God? Like, why do bad things happen to good people? Is itself an expression of an expectation that God exists. And what do I mean by that? So when a person asks, why do bad things happen to good people? One can only ask that question if one takes it as a given that the following are true. One, God is all powerful. Because if God's not all powerful, we know why bad things happen to good people, because God couldn't control the bad things from happening. We also believe that God is all-knowing. Because if God is not all-knowing, why do bad things happen to good people? Because God didn't know about it. We have an answer to our question. And the third thing that we're taking for granted to ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people, is that God is good. Because if we think God isn't good, we have an answer to our question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Because God was out to get them. But since we don't want to accept that, and since we expect God to be all-knowing, and since we expect God to be all-powerful, then we can ask the question. And if those three things are true, then the question has no answer. And so this isn't a class on theodicy where we're going to, unpack the bad things happening to good people, but it just highlights that there's a certain perspective that we all have encountered that really has us grappling with the idea of faith. And for some people, faith is stronger, and for some people, faith is less strong and more of a challenge. But just like any other endeavor, our relationship with faith changes the more we engage with it. In Judaism, we engage with it by studying, by exploring what God has done, what God did, by exploring the Torah, by exploring, by looking at Jewish tradition, by looking at Jewish history, by looking at the various incidents in our own lives. This is, if you think back to, we said that I am the Lord your God that took you out of the land of Egypt, just like the Israelites initially at Sinai explored God based on their unique experience. We do the same thing. And we talk about the expression a leap of faith. A leap of faith can be a giant, seemingly insurmountable distance for someone who's never really encountered what faith is all about. It can be something that's very simple for someone who engages with faith all the time. It's the difference between, if you can imagine an Olympic broad jumper trying to jump over a puddle at Lexington and 86th Street. For the average person, it's hard. You're going to get wet. But for someone who's used to jumping over great distances, it's not so difficult. And the idea of, there was a book that came out a number of years ago, God is a Verb. And there's a lot of truth to that expression, that the relationship with God is experienced. That doesn't absolve us from the other half part of that relationship, which is the fact that God is also master and commander. But there is this duality to our relationship with God. We experience God. We experience God as we just finished the high holidays, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. We have a relationship with God, which is like a loving parent, and we have a relationship with God, who is the demanding King. And we play out both of those relationships in our religious lives. And that's where Judaism started. Again, bringing us back to where we started this evening. That all came from that initial encounter with God, that initial declaration, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. When we're connecting to God, it is very much about that connection. It is very much about that religious experience. But it's not something that can be absolutely commanded the same way. And at the same time, you can't say, well, I don't feel it yet, so I'm not going to practice or I'm not going to observe, because both are essential. There's an expression in Pirkei Avot called teachings of our ancestors, teachings of the fathers. It's a section in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, where the expression is, you're not responsible to finish the job, but you can't ignore your responsibility to engage with the endeavor. It's an Israeli song also. Now, for those of you who know it, are going to be humming it in your heads. But we have a responsibility to engage with it. And Judaism recognizes that it's not all or nothing. Judaism recognizes that it's not simple, but Judaism recognizes that there's a requirement to balance both of these sides of the equation. So for example, we talk about deed and creed, religious obligation, religious experience. Judaism very much prioritizes action over experience. Right, the same section of the Talmud says that Lo ha-midrash ha'ikar ela ha-ma'aseh. The explanation and exploration and the learning is not important, rather it's the action. So Judaism prioritizes doing what God demands, performing the commandments. At the same time, both are necessary. Rabbi Norman Lamb, the late rabbi and scholar who was president of Yeshiva University, had written a lot about faith and Jewish philosophy. Someone, if you haven't explored, you can Google him and look him up and find some of his essays. Passed away just in the last couple of months. He was a rabbi for many years and then president of Yeshiva University. And the sermons that he gave 50 and 60 years ago still speak to us today. It's really showing the timelessness of some of these ideas within Judaism. But he talks about that when we talk about deed and creed, these are analogous to law and spirit, right? Deed, action, obligation, law, creed, belief, faith, religious experience, spirit. So you have the law and the spirit. And Rabbi Lamb says that the law is similar to the body, and the spirit is similar to the soul. So you have body and soul. If you have the spirit, the religious experience, the soul without the body, well, what's something that's a soul without a body? That's a ghost. It's not anchored in reality. If you have the law and the obligation in the body without the soul, without the religious experience, well, what's a body without a soul? It's a corpse. It's dead. So we may prioritize action, the body, but we're not looking for a dead Judaism. We're not looking for something that's just based on religious experience. We're looking for something that's the amalgam of both, that combines the religious experience with the religious obligation. We want a living, breathing, alive Judaism, not an amorphous ghost nor a lifeless corpse. And we see within Jewish life that there are trends that seem to try and separate the two and prioritize one to the exclusion of the other. In some corners of the Jewish world, you have an abandonment of religious obligation and commandment, and a focus more on the religious experience. In some parts of the Jewish community, you have a more doubling down on fulfilling the obligation, everyone acting the same way regardless of the thinking and the belief. I think that we have, in much of the non-Orthodox world, there's an abandonment of obligation and ritual. And in the Orthodox world, sometimes there's the overemphasis on obedience without understanding. At the end of the day, which has a better track record of ensuring the continuity of the Jewish people? The obligation. Right, the Orthodox side of the equation is growing, even if they're not necessarily integrated enough with the religious experience. On the other side of the equation, there's a lot more assimilation, and that doesn't mean that that all of non-Orthodox Judaism is disappearing and will go, and all of Orthodox Judaism is guaranteed. But just by the numbers in the Orthodox community, where they prioritize, as Judaism has traditionally done, the obligation. It continues. Like I said, there are difficulties with that. Like Norman Lamb points out, who wants a Judaism that's corpse-like, that has obligation without religious experience? But we can appreciate that. We can appreciate the religious experience is more personal. It's sometimes easier. It doesn't require the same commitment in time and submission as obligation. We'll talk more about Shabbat, but think about Shabbat. What's more popular, eating challah on Shabbos or not using money on Shabbos? Right, everybody, unless you're like celiac or you don't eat gluten, everybody likes challah. Everyone likes kiddush. When it comes to the more complicated obligations that ask more of us, those are a little bit more complicated. And all of this comes together within our understanding of God. Our relationship with God it calls upon us to experience the divine through beauty, through relationships, through meditation, but it also is demanding certain obligations that we submit to God's authority on certain things. And it's about finding that happy medium between deed and creed. And it's acknowledged, I think, that one of the major challenges to this has been the modern era. Something that Norman Lamb also talks about in his book, Faith and Doubt, is that we live in a time, and I think it's been true of the modern era, as man has been seeking for answers for everything and trying to explain away the unknown and to, on some level, conquer God. It's harder to believe. He quotes a number of different approaches within 20th century Jewish thinkers that, look, we don't live in an era of prophecy anymore, right? It's, if God came and gave me a sign, I'd believe, right? They tell this story in Israel about Moshe, who's late for an appointment and circling in search of a parking spot, getting very nervous, and finally decides he'll make a deal with God. God, if you help me find the parking spot, I will observe Shabbat. I love Shabbat, but I'll observe Shabbat. Just help me find the parking spot, God. All of a sudden, right in front of him, a car pulls out. Answer to his prayers, right? Moshe turns to God and says, never mind, God, I found one myself. right? He thinks that's sometimes the way it works. Even the signs that we have of God's existence aren't really signs because no one's telling us what to do anymore in the same way. And there's also the fact that the world around us is very much focused on rationality and philosophy and finding the answers ourselves. So whether it be the change in how God speaks to us and not speaking to us the same way, or the zeitgeist around us, there are good reasons that get in the way of making it easy for us to combine the deed and the creed and connect to God this way. And so it's understandable, and it's an additional challenge that we have in Judaism today. So that all emerges from this idea of God. Any questions, comments, thoughts? All right. Hopefully either everyone's a believer or you're all denying, one or the other. I don't want anything in between. So this exploration, we then move on to prayer. And prayer is the next rung on the ladder. And in particular, prayer is the next rung on the ladder because prayer in many ways is how we articulate, is a way that we articulate our faith. Think of a typical Jewish prayer service. I hope, many of you, if not all of you, have seen it before. Right? If you ever walk into a synagogue, what are you likely to encounter? You'll see people who are standing and swaying and moving their lips. Right? Looks familiar? Now, so literally, to engage in that activity involves, on some level, acknowledging that there's a God. Either I believe in that God and I'm praying, or I don't believe in that God and everyone else is praying. There's something going on with prayer that has to do with God. Right? This is not me. I don't need to go to synagogue to talk to somebody else. So prayer is really the ritual, the mitzvah, the religious obligation within Judaism in which we articulate our faith in God. And remember, faith is not just I believe, as we discussed. Faith is a more complex, heavy experience with God of deed and creed. So prayer is when we articulate that. And this is something that's found biblically in Roman numeral 3, source number 1, from the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, where we read, Shifchi kamayim libech nochach pnei Hashem. Pour out your heart like water before the Lord. There's an element of prayer which acknowledges that it's a very emotional experience. Think of if you were in synagogue for any of the recent high holidays or Sukkot, whether it be Yom Kippur when there was the confession, or whether it be on Sukkot where there was the joyous Hallel song. It's an emotional experience. There's joy, there's pain. It's the creed. It's the religious experience of Judaism. Prayer is that opportunity. At the same time, in the Shema prayer, which we recite, the Shema prayer, one of the most famous prayers in Judaism, the second paragraph of it begins with, if you will listen to God and obey the commandments, to love the Lord your God, to serve him with all your heart, with all your soul. The Hebrew is ula avdo bechol levavchem, to serve God with your hearts. That word avdo in Hebrew is the root of eved, which is slave. Right? Think back to the end of the first commandment, house of slavery, house of bondage. So on the one hand, we relate to God by pouring out our hearts in an emotional way. And here we're told that how do our hearts serve God? Like slaves, commanded. We are avadim. Our faith is commanded to be articulated out of us. So these are seemingly diametrically opposed experiences. On the one hand, it's joy, it's pain, it's emotion. On the other, it's obligation. You got to say this. And when you think about Jewish prayer, you can probably identify some of the both of these experiences, both the emotional and obligation within Jewish prayer. When you think about it, when it comes to the emotion, the fact that that prayer represents, we have words of love, and we have we add song to prayer, and we sway, and we have emotion. But we also have sometimes a very rigorous structure, right? We read from a prayer book, which has the same text that everyone recites. We have certain times when we stand and when we sit. We have 3 steps forward and 3 steps back. We have certain bending and bowing. Those of you who've been in our beginner service before, right? There are a lot of stage instructions that are part of it. Not only that, prayer becomes an obligation. We're obligated to pray to God 3 times a day. Here's an issue that I think comes up for those getting used to prayer. Is it better to pray in English and understand what you're saying, or break your teeth over the Hebrew and have no idea what you're saying? Which of them is religiously superior? What do you think? Don't be shy, people.
Is it about religious superiority, or is it about like the emotion or the sincerity?
You tell me.
I don't think it matters. I think that whatever language you're praying in, God hears you.
We have the nihilist here. No, we have the no. So look. In classic Jewish fashion, you're right and you're right and you're right. It's like the rabbi who is hearing an argument between 2 students, and his wife is next standing in earshot, and the first person presents their claim, and the rabbi goes, "Oh, you're right," but the other student says, "No, Rabbi, you don't understand. It's this is how it is." And the rabbi shakes his head and says, "Oh, you're right." And his wife calls over, "How can they both be right?" And the rabbi says, "You're right too." So that's classically in Judaism we can have multiple opinions and multiple perspectives, and you're both right. And on some level, it's true. God can understand any language. So why pray in Hebrew? Why read a transliterated prayer book if you could just read it in English or the language you understand? So that is 100% true. At the same time, normative, more commonly practiced Judaism would, in a sense, at times prioritize, say it in the Hebrew, even if you have no idea what you're saying. That's not viewed as a negative, at least. You are equal. They're equally valid to pray and have no clue what you're saying and praying in English. And one is not better than the other. How about that? It's not superiority anymore. It's that one is not better than the other. How is that possible? Because while prayer is meant to be understood, while it's meant to be meaningful, it's also a religious obligation. And that there's something to be said in that religious obligation in praying in the same language that Jews have prayed for the last 2,500 years. And saying the same words that Jews have prayed for the last 2,500 years. So since 2,500 years ago, the prayer was initiated with these words, it's very valid and meaningful to say those exact same words in a language you don't understand, reciting them in a transliteration, not with even the original Hebrew letters. There's validity to that. And yes, there's validity in prayers being recited the same in a language you understand, or that meet your where you're at spiritually. Another example, a lot of someone has asked us, you look at the prayers, there's a prayer in the Shemona Esrei blessing prayer, and one of the central prayer for Jews 365 days a year is called the Shemona Esrei, or Amidah. It's a standing prayer with multiple blessings. During the week it has 19, on Shabbat it has 7, but this is the pinnacle of Jewish prayer. And one of the blessings is all about, destroy our enemies. So someone once asked the question, why is it so negative? Why is it so violent? Why, someone's, why is it so, conservative? Why can't it be more progressive? Why can't we, pray for peace? Why can't we pray for some love? Why do we have to pray for destruction? I said, well, first of all, there is a blessing for peace. It comes at a different point in the prayer. But again, some of this emerges from the zeitgeist of when the prayers were composed. And it's not our job to recreate it. It's our job, maintaining continuity is also important. And, which is why the common approach to prayer prioritizes or assigns, aspirationally pray what's in the text, what's in the prayer book, the way it's always been done, and then add what you want. Find ways to make it more meaningful. This was especially relevant both in Talmudic times, where there was a lot more to prayer than just the text, and when the Hasidic movement emerged in the 18th century, where the Hasidic movement was focused on the soul and spirituality and not just on the obligation. So the answer is not one or the other, it's both. It's finding that synthesis and synergy, not throwing away the traditional language and text, even if it's less relevant, but also not ignoring our soul's desire to strive and to feel the emotion. Prayer is both obligation and an outpouring of the soul. And it's really in that synergy. So prayer now actually becomes an articulation of faith, which actually embodies the tension as well as the synergy of the religious experience and the religious obligation. We're obligated to pray 3 times a day. Because think about it, if we were left to our own devices, we'd only pray when we felt we were in the mood. And sometimes people will say that being obligated to pray 3 times a day makes them feel closer to God. The same thing with the rules of the synagogue and the way, the idea that these are all examples where our religious experiential creativity is sometimes held back by religious obligation. I sometimes mention as an example, where the two of these can sometimes collide, there's prayer 3 times a day. So the best way to pray 3 times a day is to pray with the community. If you pray in synagogue and you schedule to go 3 times a day, you're sure to get it done. This day and age, you can zoom in a lot of these things, or live stream, so it's, it sets up your prayer schedule. But as someone who has been praying my whole life, that the morning service is one it's very hard to forget. You start your day with it. Sometimes the afternoon service, which is in the afternoon or before sunset, that also, is pretty, it's actually the hardest because it comes in the middle of your day, but it's also fulfilling because you stick God into the middle of your day. The nighttime service, if you're not praying in synagogue, can be very easy to forget because it's set at night, and then, as the evening comes, it's dinner time, and then you start relaxing, and then it's, bedtime, and wait a second, I didn't daven. So what happens, and this has happened in my own personal experience, what happens if it's now midnight, I'm in bed, and as I'm turning off the light, I realize I did not pray the evening service. So let's play this out. If I was a holy person, I'd be very excited to jump out of bed and have a wonderfully uplifting Mariv evening service, even though it's 12:15, I was ready to turn out the lights 2 minutes ago. Halavai, we would say. Ideally, that would be wonderful. Another possibility, in my own experience, more likely is, okay, I got to do it. Get out of bed, blah, 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 really fast, get it done, check off the box. I did it. I'm not proud of it, but I did it. Not my best service, but I did it. What's another possibility? Good night. Exactly. All right. There's always tomorrow. So of options 2 and 3, I think you see really the tension, right? It's more religiously genuine to turn out the lights and go to sleep and ignore that religious obligation. It's not a real genuine prayer to rush through it, half asleep. But that, in that example, in those options and the pathways, you find some of this tension between the deed and the creed and the religious experience or religious obligation. And so what we have been looking at this evening, so far is the way our connection to God puts us on this encounter with religious experience or religious obligation, and the two are complementary and ideally is synergy. But recognizing that sometimes it's easy to focus and prioritize one over the other to the detriment of the totality. That prayer is an opportunity to act upon or speak out our faith. And within the very exercise of Jewish prayer, contained within it are examples of this interplay between religious experience and religious obligation. The fact that we're obligated to pray a certain text, and there's value in praying, even if you don't understand it, don't even mean it, while at the same time being sure to try and complement things with the full spirituality and religious experience. As well as the fact that, and you see in source number 3 under prayer, that, that really what prayer is, and the blessings are meant to do is to engender within us a God awareness. And the blessing that's there is the blessing that's recited after going to the bathroom. We Jews have blessings for everything. We don't bless in the bathroom, but we bless out of the bathroom. But when you read about it, it's about God in whose wisdom created within man all types of openings. And if even one of them is blocked, it becomes impossible to survive. That's very true. Ask anyone who's ever had a kidney stone, right? The blessings are there to draw out of us a certain awareness. The blessings that Jews recite over food before and after. And we'll talk a little bit more about it next week. I'm going to talk more about ritual, but it's an opportunity to encounter this faith. And we're pushed to do so because there's an obligation to say these blessings. There's an obligation to say these prayers. And I think that, looking at the foundation this week, we started with the 10 Commandments, and why they called it the 10 Commandments. I think the movie gave it the name 10 Commandments. No, it's the idea. They are the 10 statements. These were an important part of that initial divine revelation from God to humanity, and in particular the Jewish nation surrounding Sinai. So they do get they are a proper noun, even if they're not necessarily exclusively 10 individual commandments, and they may be headings for a larger Torah system. So they are significant, even if in Hebrew they're called deep road statements. But where we start with that is God is calling to humanity for a relationship, calling to the Jewish people for a relationship. And that relationship involves religious experience, seeking out a personal religious experience, and also recognizing that it comes with religious obligation. And our connection with God involves both of these themes. And we can't be commanded to believe, but we can be told to seek out God and try and the more we engage with that concept, the more we will develop just like when we exercise, we develop a healthier, muscle system. When we encounter God this way, we have a more robust system of faith. So that's in the theoretical. We begin to make it practical, in particular with prayer and blessings, which are an articulation. Why pray unless there's a relationship with God? And within prayer itself, we begin to play out this dichotomy of deed and creed, of religious obligation, religious experience. And we're going to take this further into the system of Jewish practice, in particular, highlighting next week Shabbat, and how Shabbat plays a seminal role in Jewish religion and observance, we'll also focus that Shabbat is prototypical Jewish ritual experience and the role that ritual plays in all of this. And we'll close it out with a discussion of how once we have this system, we also have to sanctify the relationship. That Judaism is not meant to be lived in a silo as an individual, it's meant to be shared with other people as well. If there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them. A reminder, if you would please send an email to esther@ckj.org, email address in the chat, just with your name, and then they'll have the email address so that we can just keep track of everybody and make sure we can let people know if anything changes, as well as send any updates or other materials. If you have any questions for me, my email is now in the chat as well. Please consider joining. If you're all excited, then 8:45 zoom into the KJV virtual pre-Shabbat experience. You can find the link for that, as well as a good link to know ckj.org/VDS, where our virtual daily schedule goes. If you want more of me, 8:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, we'll be having a TGOS class. Thank God it's Shabbos. To talk a little bit about the weekly Torah portion, as well as topics relating to the Shabbat celebration. And all the other classes information can be found online. So I look forward to rounding out this part of MJL with you next week before the course continues further down the calendar. And again, any questions, please feel free to ask, and I hope everyone has a good evening.